Well, welcome everybody to this session on maintenance and retrofitting, a crucial and creative challenge for today. My name's Robert Huxford. I'm director of the Urban Design Group. It's a national charity dedicated to improving the designs of towns and cities. I'm also a member of the Institution of Civil Engineers Municipal Expert Panel and an author of the UK Guide on Highway Risk and Liability Claims, which is where maintenance goes wrong. The public sue the Highway Authority. Maintenance is a very much neglected area. Politicians like to open new schemes. They like to pour money into new and shiny things, whereas the actual business of place keeping things in good repair, looking after them, polishing them, cleaning, clearing blockages, very much gets neglected. It's not a politically sexy activity, and yet it's probably more important than creating the thing in the first place. If you can't maintain it, don't think about creating it. You've heard quite enough from me already, and you want to hear from the speakers, and we have a glittering galaxy of expertise this afternoon. First of all, I'd like to welcome Professor Sarah Bell. She's a professor of environmental engineering and also a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers. She'll be talking about maintenance, valuing a caring and vital profession. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's very good to be back at Future Build again this year. And it's also really nice to be talking about maintenance, which, in my opinion, and presumably all of yours, we need to talk a bit more about. So I'm an environmental engineer. I'm not a maintenance engineer. And I'm an academic. I don't manage assets. I don't run a maintenance program. So I'm not here talking out of any personal professional experience, but more about my reflections on my observations about my own profession and the things that we value. And importantly, what I think some things that really need to change if we are to have any hope of addressing the climate and ecological emergencies that we find ourselves in. So the undervaluing of maintenance and the failure to manage it properly are problems that are cut across all disciplines in the built environment and all sorts of organisations. I'm going to be speaking today here specifically as an engineer, as a chartered engineer, as a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and someone who's taught engineering at university for the last 15 years. So engineering has a problem with maintenance. We're all eager to gather at events like this and talk about how important maintenance is, and it's very easy to blame governments and financiers and managers for not investing properly in maintenance. But I think it's important that we also take a look at ourselves as engineers within our profession and how we present ourselves to the world and what that might mean in terms of why maintenance is undervalued. So as engineers, we promote ourselves as people who build things, typically big things: power stations, high-speed railway lines, super sewers, high-rise buildings, opera houses, and so on. And when we do outreach to schools, as I have done and my colleagues do, and we're trying to attract students into our university courses, we show them shiny new buildings, we show them big, complex new structures. We don't show them the people that keep the railways running. When we, in our undergraduate degree courses, we place a lot of emphasis on design, and we set students projects to design complex new things: airports, harbours, municipal buildings. It's very rare in our university courses to set engineering students a design project to design a program to maintain and retrofit an existing building. We make heroes of Bazalgette and Brunel and Arup, the people who built things. We have prizes every year for the best new project that's been delivered. As far as I'm aware, we don't have any prizes for the best 25-year-old project, the projects that have stood the test of time and have been well maintained. So in the last few years, we have started to pay more attention to design for maintainability, but maintenance itself is still in the shadows. It's something necessary but dull. It's not something to celebrate or promote. And in our obsession to build new stuff and in celebrating the people who design and build these new things, we fail to take care of what we've got. Now, if sustainability is to have any chance, that's absolutely where we have to start. We have to start by taking care of and improving the world as it is, the buildings and the infrastructure we've already got. We can't just keep building new stuff. We can't keep digging up the earth, burning carbon to create structures and then just let them all fall apart. Now, the second law of thermodynamics, as we know, tells us that we need to do work to create and maintain order. We do an awful lot of work to refine the materials that go into our structures and then to form these complex structures in the first place. And then we let an awful lot of that work go to waste as entropy takes over and our structures decline and degrade. So in terms of the relative efforts of materials, energy, time and money, good maintenance is always more efficient than starting from scratch. But that's not how we think of ourselves as engineers and innovators. We make our money and we stake our professional pride on making new things, not taking care of the old. We value production, we don't value care. We value making new things. We don't value keeping things going. And that's what has to stop. We simply don't have enough resources, energy, or atmosphere left to just keep building new stuff. We can't keep creating order just to let it degrade, or even worse, to deliberately tear it apart. Now, this is not something unique to engineering or infrastructure. It's symptomatic of our culture. We shamefully undervalue the people who do caring in our society. Nurses, social workers, childcare workers, cleaners, and the vast, invisible, mostly unpaid labour of carers within families and communities. Now, these are some of the most overworked, vulnerable people in our society, and yet none of us would be here without them. Now, I hope it's not too controversial to point out that most caring work in our society is women's work. In a world still shaped by gender categories, caring is feminine. That's not to say that all women are carers or caring. I myself don't have children and my parents live on the other side of the world, so in terms of a carefree woman, I'm about as close as you get. It's also not to say that men don't do care work, because they absolutely do. But the signals that our society sends about what's really important, what really matters, and how things get divided up between the genders, as they still do, caring work is largely work done by women, out of sight, underpaid or unpaid. So in a masculine, male-dominated profession like engineering, is it any surprise that maintenance is forgotten? Yes, as a profession, we do design for maintenance and we argue for maintenance budgets and we complain about the short-sighted government or management cuts to maintenance budgets. We talk about life cycle costs. But when we think about the things that we publicly value, the people who get promoted, the brochures and videos we send out to schools, it's not about maintenance. Engineers are not very good at caring, and we need to do better. So if we are to create more sustainable cities, then all of us need to do more sustaining work. We need to take better care of what we've got. And that requires a fairly serious, deep change in our professional identity. So yes, the spreadsheets and life cycle assessment, finance models, and contracts and all of that need to be worked out. That is important. But fundamentally, we have to shift what we value, what we promote, and what we define as good engineering. It's my hope that if we start to take better care of our cities, our buildings, and our infrastructures, we'll also be taking better care of each other. We'll certainly be taking better care of the planet. If we start emphasising care, durability, restoration, repair, and maintenance, we might also shift the image of the engineer. If engineering becomes more caring, and if care is properly rewarded, then it might look like a fulfilling career for people who aren't interested in building ever bigger, ever shinier structures. I'm not suggesting maintenance by any means is the miracle cure to address the gender imbalance in my profession. But I think that if we do start taking better care of the structures and systems that we've already built, making the world better as it already is, our profession might be better able to meet the needs of the communities that we serve and to keep them safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That's an interesting angle, isn't it? And we do neglect care, and it's almost institutionally embedded in the systems that we've got. VAT, all the products that are being sold today for the construction of new houses, zero rate VAT, adaptation refurbishment will attract, what was it, 20% VAT? That doesn't seem to be a sensible or a sustainable way of going about things. Thank you very much for injecting a very human dimension, and maybe we do need to fundamentally rethink the way we go about things, and how better a word is care than maintain. How much more human. Next, funding maintenance in the public realm. Dr. Peter Kenway, Director and Co-founder of the New Policy Institute. This is going to be a fascinating presentation, and once again we've got this bias towards major schemes for capital works and so little that gets directed towards maintenance. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. I must confess first in this company to being an economist, on the assumption that most of you are either engineers or some sort of engineers. Obviously, you'll all be well aware of the tensions that exist between, in some sense, not even glorified bean counters, but economists and the accountants on the one hand and yourselves on the other. I, like Sarah, am not responsible for anything. I run a very, very small organisation, effectively a little consultancy, but I have done quite a lot of work over the past 5 or 6 years with an umbrella organisation in local government called the Association of Public Service Excellence, APSI. I don't know whether you've come across APSI. I think they're great. They, in some sense, are the bit of local government that tries to represent all the things that local government does that isn't social care, really. And in what Sarah was saying about the undervaluing of care in the widest sense, there are several echoes, I think, in terms of what I see about local government. Now, let me try to get this right. No. How about this? That's worked. I've just got a few graphs, not many. They're all extremely gloomy. And I think really all they're talking about is the spending that, the cuts in spending that have taken place at several different levels. And I think the important thing to say is that 10 years ago, when austerity began, the idea that we would be where we are now in terms of what we have lost, and indeed, as far as one can tell, where we are still heading, it would have been absolutely unthinkable. Now, that is not to say that 10 years ago we did not need austerity. What this graph shows, let me see if I'm going to give it another thing there. This is expenditure, local government spending, that's local government in the widest sense, so that will include police, as a share of the economy. This is one way of measuring, one way of looking at this is like the importance of local government in the economy, and in some sense, from an economic point of view, the importance of local government in society. You know the arguments about the importance of manufacturing. Manufacturing used to represent such and such a percent of the economy. It now represents a different and lower set. And that's interpreted as reflecting importance in an economic sense. The left hand, where's the left hand? The left hand is effectively the crash in about 2007-8. The peak is about 2010. And the thing on the right is about where we are now. Now, the first point to make is that 10 years ago, local government had grown too large. If you just look at it in very simple arithmetic terms, it was at a historically very high level. And so in some sense, the argument that local government needed to come down, needed to take a smaller share, if you were pushing that in 2009, 2010, actually you would have found many people in local government who agreed with that. So that initial reduction made, you know, in a simplistic way, fairly good sense. I think the solid black line, I think it'll say if I point at this. So the solid black line is the average back to the late 1970s, which older viewers will remember, understand the significance of that. That's really when the Thatcher government came to power. The black line, the solid line's the average. The lighter line, I think it's dotted, but the lighter line beneath it is the historic low point. And in fact, it's a low point since 1965. So in some sense, over the years, from the mid-60s through to really about 2005, the whole political debate about the importance of local government oscillated between those two lines. After 2007, it jumped. Since then, it's fallen and continued to fall. And so we are now in a position where local government's importance is way below what it has, in fact, historically been even since the late 1940s. So point one, the squeeze on local government. Point two, the squeeze in local government. The blue here, doesn't really matter what the numbers are exactly. The blue here represents spending on social care. Sort of squeezed, did drop up to about 12, 13 and has then risen very slowly. Still much less than the need for social care, there's been no doubt about that. But those blue bars have kind of held up. The red bars are everything else. And everything else is what, with APSI, we call neighbourhood services that broadly falls into four groups of culture, environment, planning and highways and transport. This is in real terms. This is so what we're seeing here is a consistent squeeze within local government. And so the maintenance budgets, the money where the maintenance is coming from, neighbourhood services have borne the brunt of the government cuts. Local government's borne the brunt of cuts within the public sector, and neighbourhood services has borne the brunt of cuts within local government. Social care and social care's growth has continued but has been held back well below what would be needed simply on demographic grounds. So point number three, this is now a bit more detailed. This is a breakdown into broad groups of what's in that neighbourhood services thing. If you look second from the bottom, in there we've got road maintenance and highways. If you have a look at that, you can see the blue line, I think, is, if you like, the long-term average, the 12-13 figure, 4 billion was spent then. That's now dropped in the latest year, which is probably only 18-19, to 3.5. That, if you look over on the left, that's a 13% fall in spending. So that, in some sense, that's a 13% fall after the excess was taken out. If you take the simple view that there was an excess at the beginning, even after the excess overall has gone, we've seen a further 13% cut. Now, you can see down there, it's still the case. Although local government is very resistant of the idea that all it does is the bins, doesn't like that idea. It's not true. Nevertheless, as the bars at the bottom show, A, it's still the biggest bit, depends a bit how you divide it up, waste, not just collection, but also waste processing and recycling. And second, it doesn't really look as if that has taken any particular cuts in the last 6 years. You've got a bunch of other things. Sport and recreation at the top, open spaces, these are quite small and have been squeezed tightly, 34% sport and rec. There is other environment, regulatory and community, all this stuff about who inspects the, who makes sure your restaurants are safe, these completely unsexy services that are actually vital if you're going to have your evening out and not be ill. Public transport, again, the cut from the peak there. Arts and libraries, substantial. So cuts across the board in stuff that on the one hand is not eye-catching. It's not politically sensitive in the way that adult and increasingly child social care are. But nevertheless, vital. And in some sense, you've got the kind of care and maintenance that you're talking about in there. There's a whole bunch of other services that very much, I think, fall into that category of the things that keeps our society running, the sorts of things, not all of them, but the sorts of things that Sarah was talking about. These are profoundly unfashionable. They have little political weight, and yet their importance is considerable. I have to say two other things about local government before coming to the final slide. One is, my numbers here on the second and third slides are for England. There are differences in Wales and Scotland, but it's more about timing. The scale is pretty much the same. Scotland followed a slightly different path, but it's very much in the same place. And the second thing, which I think is hugely important to understand if you're working with local government, or if you want to understand why local government is so politically powerless against central government, which is that these are averages. My numbers are totals or they're averages. And the variation between prosperous local authorities that receive little grant from central government and never did receive much, you can think where they are, prosperous southeastern rural districts, all places, including in London, which are growing rapidly. The outcomes for some authorities in the last 10 years have really not been bad at all, and the outcomes for others, and I think particularly if you think of rather more remote sort of coastal communities, perhaps poor coastal communities, the outcomes have been eye-watering. We're talking 60% cuts. These aren't cuts. This is dismantling services, an essential part. And we have seen over the last 10 years a dismantling of what local government does in a way that I would have expected was really unacceptable. Are there any reasons for optimism apart from the fact that this is my last slide? Well, local government has, and this really I think relates to what Sarah was saying about the low status of care. The low status of local government, this is a bit of the state that does stuff. It's not policy for the most part. It's not high, it's not central government. Local government's low state is in line with the idea that we undervalue those who do things. The demographics are challenging. Over the next 3 or 4 years, we will see a 15% growth in the over 75 population. That has enormous implications for care. Local government struggles to be united. I've kind of touched on that. No agreement on what fairness would look like. We've learned you never say local government is on the brink. That phrase, it's on the brink, it's about to collapse, that's not what's happened unless there's been a financial blow-up. Local government sort of doesn't collapse in that way. But what has happened to it is it's been hollowed out. So it keeps going. It does still empty the bins, but it's losing the capacity, and this was in some ways the most interesting piece of work we did with local government was around this qualitative stuff. Losing a capacity to lead, it's losing its experienced people, it's losing a capacity to reflect, to plan, to take preemptive action. It's always reacting. That's really, I think, what these cuts have done. It's hollowed them out. It hasn't pushed them over the edge, but it's hollowed them out. You won't find them a strong partner. And finally, of course, a mathematical point really, this lack of maintenance is a cumulative problem. In the early years of austerity, public, even if came back and said, well, we don't really notice that things have got worse. And in some sense, one doesn't. It takes, it's a stock problem. It's a cumulative effect of year after year. And the downside of that is that turning that round also takes not just an end to austerity, but sustained re-resourcing of local government over several years. There is, I'm afraid, no prospect of that at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think that's quite a disturbing picture, and we're living in it. In my own experience, I met a roads maintenance operative chap in the Lake District at the beginning of last year, and he gave an instance of the county were intending to put 100,000 quid into sorting out some sort of drainage problem. However, he'd been on the job for 20 years in the local authority, and he knew the drainage system. He said, well, look, all you have to do is you just unblock that gully up there, something like that. Couldn't quite follow what he was saying. But, 100,000 quid or maybe 200 quid, that's the difference. Another example, a local authority in London commissioned a major study to improve an area. They'd forgotten that they'd commissioned a study 8 years ago. So it's a repetition, and this is the loss of a corporate memory. And I guess it's the loss of the ability to act as a competent client, a competent authority. Anyway, next, surface water management, maintaining SUDS. Sue Illman, Managing Director Illman Young and co-author of the Syria SUDS Construction Manual, which is 800 pages long. It's more. That's a SUDS manual. How long is the SUDS Construction Manual? 50 pages, 150 pages. Enthusiastic about water-sensitive urban design. Anyway, I'll stop wittering on and invite Sue. Also a former president of the Landscape Institute.
Right. Oh, good, I've got my cheerleaders with me. Excellent. I'm a landscape architect in private practice, and as Robert has said, has been involved in writing a number of guidance documents and continue to do so, and spend a lot of my time working with engineers. So, SUDS and maintenance, why is that maintenance essential? So, I think the question is how we're thinking about things now. To this here at Future Build this week, massive amount of talking around the climate emergency, sustainable development goals, and clearly we've had all these recent experiences of flooding. And so we really have to focus our minds on what we're doing, how we're going to do it, but also bearing in mind how we're going to look after it in the long term. So really just to say, why do we need to change, and how can sustainable drainage systems actually assist? And particularly the soft planted ones. So how are they going to do it? Well, actually, because they do quite a lot in terms of the uptake of water, the soil and the plant surfaces provide what's called interception, holding that water in themselves so it doesn't actually discharge. They can improve water quality, and then there's these whole raft of other benefits that people really understand, which applies more generally about air quality, urban heat island. This is the sort of thing we're talking about all the time now. Migration corridors, species migrations, opportunities for biodiversity in our towns and cities. And you're pulling all those things together to improve the quality and condition of the urban environment, and therefore the health and well-being benefits that can accrue as a consequence of that. In terms of retrofitting, which I was particularly asked to look into, I think the key for doing this is the fact that we can have this incremental but immediate effect in what we're doing. Even making small localised changes can have a significant benefit to those communities who are directly affected. Not the big scale flooding problems, but the small incidental day-to-day flooding that actually the people in 2 streets away have got no idea is happening to people in their own homes. So we can do a lot of this. It's just you have to have a mindset that says, how can we do it? How can we integrate these into the urban environment? And the best way to do that is to actually integrate it with other things that are happening and alongside and aligning it with all the other objectives that there are. And this is something that we can do. Elsewhere in the world, they've done huge amounts of it. Portland, 56,000 downspouts that have been done. And the point about that is that's in people's own gardens. So if you had a house there and you wanted to do it, you could register your site and they could count you in that mix. That was a really important part of them managing their flooding problems and their pollution problems in Portland. But more importantly, that means that that's 56,000 families potentially who are actually maintaining their own drainage systems. So we then get the double whammy benefits is that it's the individual who's taken that initiative to make change, to improve the circumstance that's there, and then actually take on that obligation for its ongoing maintenance. And it's similarly true in Philadelphia. Their 25-year plan is much more broad-ranging, or as is indeed is Portland's, but downspouts are just one part of what they're doing, and that is the general approach that's happening. So just to talk about some of the things that we've done here and how maintenance is important. So not only are we doing things like retrofitting, in our urban environments, most of our towns and cities have been going through this process of revisioning and reimagining themselves and modernising their systems, and that particularly affects highways. So this is a fairly typical example that you may have seen in the past and something which we're changing quite radically. This is Ashford in Kent, and it was done a number of years ago to change that from what it was to what it is now. And these were taken in a number of years ago. So a radical change in that whole thing, and you can see how it's delivering against all of these goals, but how have they maintained it? Now, I haven't been there that recently, but my understanding is it's not looking as good as it might because of that, lack of commitment to maintenance in the longer term. So then there's a need to actually go back and redo in part what you're doing. It's still functioning. This is still delivering the sustainable drainage that it needs to, and clearly the hard surfaces are going to be in good condition. They're all newly developed, but we actually need those planted elements here to be making their contribution as well. So when we're designing and building even these new systems, we must understand what that maintenance commitment is and factor it in along with the road sweeping and all of the other things that we might be doing. So how do we actually tackle that maintenance conundrum? Well, I think we've got to raise awareness, because the point is short-term neglect may not really seem to matter because it's not making a massive difference to the day-to-day. But it's that incremental effect of the lack of maintenance that will actually cause the longer-term problems. Because once you get to the point where you've had long-term neglect and the problem is significant, then the actual cost to repair it is way beyond what the day-to-day, year-to-year cost of ongoing maintenance would have been in the first place. Then there's the issue of actually understanding what's required. So we need to look at how is it going to affect the system's functionality and what simple activities we can actually do. Because in the main, these are very simple things. Exactly what Robert was saying. One £200 clear a drain over here saves you £20,000 reinventing a system over there. I was doing exactly the same thing when we were working on retrofitting up in Glasgow, looking at a number of districts. In one of the districts, we went to look at it and look at how we could do all these SUDS interventions. But when we were looking at doing the community consultations and talking to the local people, they said, well, when they resurfaced our street, they didn't sweep off all the stone chippings from where they did the road repair, and they blocked all the gullies. Nobody had thought to go and actually check that out. As it happened, the engineers who were looking at the volumes that we could do with this retrofitting were struggling to understand how the system was functioning. When they looked at it, there'd been a sewer collapse. So you put together sewer collapse and completely blocked road gullies, all of which could have been addressed through routine maintenance. We didn't need to do any retrofitting whatsoever. So, we have to get our minds around this conundrum, because it's actually costing us much more money than we're spending in the first place. So that frequency of doing what's necessary is really a key thing. So then I would say there's areas of opportunity as to how we might do that. And that is, we have, and you can see through the retrofitting that can be done in private properties, we can get that maintenance tied in with doing the works. So at domestic scale, we can do it. And people, if they've bothered to implement it, are going to be bothered to maintain it, and they're going to see if it goes wrong because it's in their garden, outside their front door or their back door. At the corporate level, in the main, I think it's not too bad, and we see, really comprehensive schemes for corporate offices, whether they're on roofs, on podium decks, on the ground, wherever it may be. They've invested their money in development. Their staff are using those spaces, hopefully, and therefore there is a need and an obligation and an understanding that these need to be maintained. So it's not perfect, we know that, but actually we sort of got that covered. The issue, therefore, and I think everybody's been saying this, it's about the public space and how do we address that. I mean, I think the key's got to be, we must design with the whole concept of maintenance right from the very outset. If we get the design right and we understand the maintenance costs and we ensure that those maintenance costs, because of the design, are as small as they can reasonably be, then we really don't have any excuse for not doing it. So the point was, it must be simple and easy to do. It must be safe to do without actually having lots of difficult procedures that you have to go through, so that you need trained people, or specially trained people, or all sorts of equipment, or whatever it may be. Understanding who's responsible to actually action this, so that it sits with somebody and they need to be addressing it. Are there ways of actually checking that that system is functioning? So I would say, where you're managing water on the surface, it's pretty blooming easy to see if it's gone wrong, because you can see where that problem is. You may not understand it if it's underground. Clearly we do need underground systems as well as surface systems, but surface systems at least have that advantage that you can really see where it goes wrong very quickly. Then how often are those works required? Because if you look at any maintenance schedule, you might have something that needs being looked at just to make sure it's functioning. Is it every time it rains? It doesn't have to be every week. You might need to see it when it's raining to know if it's functioning. Is it monthly? Is it quarterly? Is it once a year? So that variety of small interventions and understanding how to assess it is really quite important. And is it maintenance, or is it actually about the longer term and management? So I'm just going to sort of talk through a couple of examples very quickly, just to show how you can do it. And many of you, if you're London-based, may know about this one. This is a project of retrofitting that was undertaken by Groundwork for Hammersmith and Fulham Council. And so you can see some of the circumstances that they had there. They did have flooding in a number of areas in the site, but they also had a lot of spaces that were really just green deserts. And so it was a very comprehensive thing that was not, and they have monitored all of it in terms of water management, water quality, air quality, and particularly social value. So looking at a really broad range of criteria against which they've assessed these sorts of things. And what they now have is a whole series of very small-scale interventions throughout these estates, and the difference that they have made to the quality of life for those people there, which has not only done a huge amount in terms of taking away the flooding, but it's provided spaces and places for those people who are now actively involved in that management, take pride in their estates, and actually now sit in the external environment, talk to each other, grow plants, grow food together, and do things that they've never done before in all the years that they've lived there, and their flooding problem's gone away. Just looking at another site, one that we did in Cheltenham, near where I'm based, and this was looking at an estate where not only did they have flooding, but also as a consequence there was further flooding downstream as well. And this was a typical sort of 60s, 70s housing estate, significant, reasonable amount of green space, but pretty uninteresting green space, as you could see, apart from a few trees. So there was a plan to look at the open spaces and also to look at which front gardens they could have interventions in, and to try to engage with the local people to encourage them to enable these to be built in their own front gardens. And this is really just looking at the green space here. The issue we had here about maintenance was the fact that there's a term contractor already committed on a 6-year maintenance programme to doing this work. So the key for him was, could we determine maintenance that wouldn't cost any more than what they're already doing? And I should say, actually, on the Hammersmith and Fulham job, on there, they haven't changed the cost of maintenance at all. For all that they've done there, it is still the same. So with this, we had to look at how did we regrade the land if we were creating some attenuation ponds so that they could still mow, and how much planting we were doing that they'd actually then have to maintain the weeds. But just bear in mind, mowing grass is about the most expensive activity that you can possibly undertake if you're doing vegetation management. So anything that you can do that can provide something that needs less frequent management is actually likely to be cheaper. So without explaining the scheme particularly, but we had rain gardens in a number of front gardens where, again, the people that were there maintained them, and in the public open space we managed to come up with a regime that was completely cost neutral. So before and after, as to something that now provided sitting spaces for the community, something to look at, a place to go, where they could see their water being managed and where they could see that no longer were those properties being flooded. Taking that up to a much bigger scale, this is up in Sheffield and is known as the Greater Green Project, and you can look at this online. This road here became redundant, but wasn't needed in the same way when they completed one of their major highway schemes in the city, and they were wanting to reinvigorate this whole district within Sheffield. But clearly they were wanting to integrate a much more sustainable approach and do something with these roads which were a complete over-provision for the amount of traffic that they were going to need to be taken in the longer term. So without going into too much on that, the interventions were really quite radical and have utterly changed the whole character and context of these parts of Sheffield and created an area for people to walk and cycle and for traffic as well, but in a very different way. But one of the most important things is how they've approached it. So talking about designing it right in the first instance. So just a detail of these bioretention planters. So you can see they've got weir walls within them to hold the water back. They've got a huge capacity within them, but the water flows off in what we call over-the-edge drainage. So sediments and hydrocarbons and things from the road will be washed down into these planting areas, and that will be metabolized within these systems to actually deal with those issues. But the planting, so we've got the volume, we've got some water quality, I think you can see the amenity, and you're going to get the biodiversity. So okay, let's talk about the management. The way they do this, they've planted this extraordinarily dense matrix of a wide variety of plants. There's a small number of evergreens which are stay there, but the vast majority of this planting, if you go up there this time of year, and February is when they do it, they cut it down to ground level completely. So it probably doesn't look so great then, I will accept that, but there'll be some green structure which is there already, and then as it starts to grow, for the first month, they will hand weed out anything that's coming in that they don't want there. They then leave it for the rest of the year and do absolutely nothing at all to it whatsoever. And this was taken a couple of years ago. I was there this summer, and it is magnificent. It's absolutely beautiful. This really complex matrix of planting that is now completely self-sustaining and actually needs very little management, and has totally and utterly changed this whole part of the city and made a massive contribution in lots of different ways. So all I would say is you can do it. You just have to be brave, think about what you're designing, plan in your maintenance, and do that through your hard landscape and engineering details. Do it through understanding your planting as to what it can deliver and what maintenance regime you can afford, and then do it. And also, you know, there are other bigger scale projects around the world where we're now devoting parks, particularly to flood management and to SUDs, but again taking that very simplistic approach about how we need to manage what's there, because it's that big change that is important. But know what you're doing, plan for your maintenance, make it as cheap as you can, and it will work for you and keep going for a very long time.
Thank you, Sue. That's some very attractive projects there, and not just attractive, functional importance. Somebody's going to correct me, but isn't the UK record for intense rainfall, something like 100 millimetres in 4 hours. Is that about right? That much? Bracknell, 2007, thereabouts, something like that. So if you're going to get that much rain, and that could happen anywhere, it could happen here or where you live, that needs to be dealt with. And I think, Sue, you've got some marvellous systems there that could cope and also make people's lives better in the process. Anyway, next, we have footways and cycleways. Materials selection should be guided by maintenance, service access and reinstatement of fit for purpose for all users. Mark Philpotts, Technical Manager, Walking and Cycling, Swaker, and also author of Designing for Walking by the Chartered Institute of Highways and Transportation. And I cycled to the railway station this morning, and it's a devil's own job to avoid all the potholes and gullies by the road edge. So I'll be very interested to see what you've got to show. Thank you.
A very long title for a very short presentation, actually. So hopefully the technology carries on with us this afternoon. So this is me. I've done all sorts of things, including highways maintenance, bridge maintenance, but these days I'm happy to specialise in walking and cycling. And that's my bike there in Stratford, just to prove that I do get out on a bike. And I work for Swaco, which is the biggest company you've never heard of. We're starting to get quite a big presence in the UK now. Looking at sustainable developments from beginning to end, architecture, engineering, energy, the works. And I'm based in the London office, which is just behind Liverpool Street Station. So I guess I'm more of a curb basher and a tarmac thrower compared to the previous speakers. And I'm going to concentrate on 5 main themes here. Coherence, directness, attractiveness, safety and comfort, which are 5 ways of describing how we design for walking and cycling, stolen unashamedly from the Dutch. And the first slide has a photo of people actually doing work, the people that keep things running for us. And the interesting thing about that particular photo is it took an ordinary suburban London A road, and we fitted in a cycle track. There's a strip of concrete at one side, a useless cycle lane on the other side, and this thing was just sitting there waiting to be found. So we've got these streets. We're not going to build massive new roads certainly in cities and towns, really. So we have to retrofit what we've got. The 5 themes will overlap and contradict. And then I'm going to talk very, very briefly about materials, material choices, a little bit of utility and management as we go. So coherence is about making sure everything works as a whole so people can get from A to B. So walking and cycling we tackle at the network level. People will have destinations on main roads, so the cycle schemes that shove everybody in quiet back streets, take people away from shops to services to schools, so main roads are just as important. We do have significant barriers, which might be the roads themselves, crossing big roads, railways, rivers, and everything needs to be legible, joined up and consistent. So it doesn't matter if you're going from one borough to the next or between public and private, it needs to be understandable and legible for everybody. And this also includes the utility operators. We often forget about those when we develop schemes. The photo is Lea Bridge Road in Walden Forest, which is a massive retrofit scheme, which has added some really good walking and cycling infrastructure. So the implications for coherence in terms of maintenance is users need to understand what's expected of them. We don't want people getting lost. People don't like getting lost, it scares them. We want things to be durable, easy to maintain, and that's whether it's major works or cyclical works, research, bits of patching, sweeping, that kind of thing. And if a key walking or cycling route is taken out of action, that can put a lot of people off. And also care with bespoke materials and detailing. That can be really hard to maintain. The utilities find them an absolute nightmare to deal with. So, photo just to show, this is up in Camden, appropriate maintenance for the type of infrastructure we have there. Keeps it swept, keeps it usable for people. So directness, this is about whether it's at a very, very local, through a junction or a much bigger network level issue, that people want to go from A to B in straight lines. We're moving under our own energy, we're not going to do massive diversions if we're walking and cycling. So design lines are absolute key. So people need to be able to go in the line of sight. We give people direct routes wherever we can. And directness can also be thought of in time and distance. So somebody might take a chance on some, it might be less attractive, but it's quicker, or they might go a bit further because it's nicer. Photo there just to show the cycle track being kept open at the scaffolding works, so things remain direct. I don't suggest that the photo there is any good. I won't name the contractor or the utility, but this is against a TfL trunk road in London, massive diversion, about 500 metres here, so everybody just went into the dual carriageway to get round it. So we need to maintain directness through our work sites, whether it's maintenance or utilities or developments. Materials which are easier to reinstate will help complete the works more quickly. Where we put utility chambers will have a bearing on how people go about their work, and that extends to road closures, diversions, things like that. And works planning have to look after people who are walking and cycling. Under attractiveness, it's about infrastructure which has been designed and fits in with its surroundings. So looking good doesn't necessarily mean spending lots of money on really flash materials. And the materials shouldn't compete with the street. If you've got a really nice street with great buildings, they're the things you're interested in, not the tarmac or the curbs. Good detailing to avoid material failure, rubbish, traps, ponding, that kind of thing. And investments in blue-green infrastructure, which look good, as we've heard in the previous set of slides. And avoiding clutter, things that people drive into, things that have to be maintained that we don't necessarily need. Photos from Stratford in East London, where we've got an existing gyrator has been completely transformed. Green-blue infrastructure in there, cycling infrastructure, so much better. From a maintenance point of view, difficult to maintain materials with complicated detailing means things will degrade. Sometimes you can build something and it doesn't quite fit together again when you take it up. As we've heard, maintenance budgets have been cut over the years, and it's getting harder and harder to keep on top of it. And if it's poorly maintained, the street loses its sense of place, which means people are less inclined to use it, and it's a cycle that carries on. The slide is from Greener Grangetown in Cardiff, which was a big SUDS retrofit to deal with localised flooding. And then on to safety. People want to be protected from traffic, and that could be physically or from their quality point of view. We recognise that people can make mistakes. We protect people walking from cycle traffic as well, because people are moving at different speeds. And the fabric of the highway shouldn't contribute to a danger, slip, trips and falls, classic maintenance issues. And we need to recognise that safety is both objective, that we can measure, and subjective on how people feel. The photo is from Francis Road in Waltham Forest, again another big street retrofit, making the best for walking and cycling through there. So the implications for safety in what we select in terms of materials and maintenance. The use of forgiving curbs and passively safe street furniture, so rebounding bollards, curbs that don't tip people off their bikes, preventing unauthorised traffic access to walking and cycling surfaces, the management of tree roots and appropriate species for the situation in the space, and surfaces which provide good grip for walking and cycling. And also lighting is very important. Again, it's something that has to be maintained, but it makes all the difference for people's navigation and the feeling of safety. And then comfort, and that's infrastructure that's just nice to experience. It feels comfortable. You're not delayed, there's no nuisance. So low traffic situations or protection from traffic. And in low traffic streets, if we're taking out traffic that should be on the main roads, which are structurally better for it, we can actually reduce the maintenance burden on the local streets. Keeping walking and cycling separate, unless it's in rural places, like the example from Cambridgeshire here, where it's very low cycling and walking flows. Gentle ramps, not having people having to stop every 5 minutes. 100 metres of effort is required to get going every time you stop. And just making sure that things are legible and you can wayfind them. So we've got a good photo here of getting on for a 40mm trip and that's a walking and cycling route. So this is the kind of stuff we need to avoid through selection of materials or how we maintain things. So, and that's things, it's the details, smooth surfaces, good installation and attention to ironwork, low trips, flush curbs at pedestrian crossings. If you're going from a cycle track to a carriageway, it should be asphalt to asphalt. Well-maintained signage and robust signage. A good surface water management, because you can have the best walking surface or cycling surface. If it's covered in water and ice in the winter, again, it's going to put people off. So just a couple of slides on materials then. For wheeled traffic, machine-laid asphalt is everything really for me. And I think increasingly, unless it's a high utility area, town centre or something like that, we should be machine laying asphalt footway surfaces. They stop trips, they don't hold water, they operate better. Asphalt generally is easier for maintenance and utility repairs. And red asphalt is great for cycle tracks. That's why the Dutch use it absolutely everywhere. You can patch it in ordinary black asphalt, doesn't matter. In 20 years' time, you can resurface it. And modular small element paving can look really good for footways. It's simple to reinstate. It just has to be detailed properly. On the sort of bespoke, expensive materials, if you like, you've got examples such as this one here, which I think has been like this probably the best part of 10 years in Westminster. I don't know if it's a failure or a utility trench, but it just doesn't look good anymore. Had that been asphalt, it would have been replaced by now. So HGVs and buses will damage high quality materials. We don't seem to be able to get that right in the UK. So I much prefer asphalt in that situation. Temporary repairs can also affect the safety of people walking and cycling. And we also need to consider where utilities might go. Clashes with street furniture, or if someone needs to get access to something and it closes the facility down. And with lighting, again, it needs to be easily accessible by the maintainers. So fold-down columns are brilliant for that. And if we get all of this right, and it's comfortable, it's safe, it's well maintained, it's attractive, we can see things like this happening. I don't know how on earth he does a wheelie on a Boris bike, but there you go. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Some interesting things there, and a number of things that I don't agree with. So that's going to start the conversation going. Jeremy Barrell can't be with us today, so I'm going to ask the speakers to take the rostrum. Picking up Mark's point about you can resurface a red asphalt with blacktop, or alternatively, blacktop is better than stone. This is a good point to debate, because it's whether we're maintaining for function, and what that function is, in the case of the City of London, part of the function to look good. It's meant to be an international financial capital. And if it's not looking like an international financial capital, the function isn't fundamentally being achieved. Sue's example, we're creating beautiful streetscapes that are neutral in terms of maintenance cost. So anyway, I won't witter on there, but my point there is that maintenance isn't just a utilitarian function. It's about maintaining something to do all the thing that it's supposed to do. And if it's looking good as one of the functions, then maintenance is about keeping it looking good. Right, let's have some questions. Anybody? No questions. Oh dear. Let me ask the panel. VAT. Do you want to have a chat about VAT? No? Okay. Next question. Local government funding. Is the present system broken? And what should be the alternatives?
Oh, there I am. Yes, it's been broken for a long time. one of the strange things that I do really is, if you go back far enough, is I find myself defending the government of John Major and Michael Heseltine from, well, now 25 years ago, who, certainly in local government funding particularly, set up an easy-to-understand set of arrangements that coped with the fact the fundamental problem is the huge inequality in our country, you know, the difference between one area and another, which means that you can't just, you know, what's been going on in the last 10 years has been the idea you just can leave local, the idea will be to leave local areas to raise their own funding. Well, if you're Westminster, or if you're Camden, or if you're some of the prosperous, you know, perhaps if you're at least parts of Bristol, or you can do this. There are large parts of our country you can't do that. So that I think the fundamental problem is the context of the huge inequalities that exist spatially. Local government is currently trying to work together among its constituent parts to devise what it calls a fair funding formula. That would be a step. There still has to be, however, considerable top-up. We have a hugely centralised economic and financial system, which means that in the end you can't avoid but win the agreement of central government. Whether we see any changes in, a week's time, I don't know whether we will, and even if we do, I don't know whether they will be anything like sufficient. But it is a major problem that this part of the state that is responsible for so much of the looking after is so lowly thought of, so poorly and erratically funded, and probably unable to exert sufficient pressure without pressure coming in from outside. And I think that's where you and other members, I think it's very important that this local government finance isn't just treated as a problem for local government. You, I think, talked about, mentioned, you know, they make poor client, you know, poor sort of contract managers a very important role. So I think there has to be a widening of the attention. You know, what do you want from local government? What skills do they need, and what resources do they need? And until it becomes a wider conversation, I don't think there'll be progress.
Sue?
Can I just move that into a slightly different arena? What we're now seeing, if you take it about housing, local authorities historically have always adopted public open space, and clearly now we're putting some of our drainage into those public open spaces. But in recent times, local authorities are just not doing that. So that means that not for public sector housing, but for the mass market of housing, that the developers are having to find other ways of getting that land adopted so that it can be maintained in the longer term. So at the moment, what's happening is that they're setting up management companies, that those who are buying houses on that estate get shares in, and therefore there's collective funding for that longer term maintenance. Or they can sometimes try to get some of the environmental trusts to take on some of that land, or they will just set up a system and, you know, they get contractor-led maintenance companies. So what we're actually seeing is removal from being a local authority responsibility and putting that responsibility back in onto those who are buying houses on those housing estates, and ultimately that they are having to pay for those services because the local authorities just can't do it. So we're seeing a change there. Now, we've got a system where water companies are going to start adopting sustainable drainage systems. The only problem is that they're not adopting anything that's not part of that water infrastructure. So we're then getting sort of bitty bits of management and maintenance happening. So you could say, well, that's not quite so bad because this is part of your critical infrastructure, so at least that will be managed properly. Clearly there can then be problems of demarcation and land and making sure that the maintenance around it is being managed properly. Because ultimately, that maintenance, if they're taking it on, will be reflected, no doubt, within the water utility bills, albeit it won't be substantial because as a whole these elements are not major. So I think we are seeing some transitions, particularly with new build and certainly within, the open sector, open housing market sector. So, and that type of approaches may well continue.
I suppose the question follows, is it really sensible to have management companies acting in the stead of a local authority, because it acts as a de facto local, micro-scale local authority? Does that make financial sense? It's another tier of bureaucracy. It's a load of additional contracts that have to exist. What do you think?
I'll just say I think that there are areas where it does work extremely well. I've been to some estates where they are doing it, and they're not massive estates, and where the community has taken on that responsibility and they've done it extremely well. But I don't think, can we rely on that in the longer term? And is it being rolled out everywhere, and is it working everywhere? I don't know the answer to that.
Yes, that's the key point. I'm sure they can work very well. They're bound to work well in certain situations. But the question you have to ask of all of this is, well, what's happening? What does that mean is happening, if you like, to the worst or the most deprived or the least well-resourced areas? And that unless you have a comprehensive approach, then actually you'll be probably increasing inequalities, perhaps at quite a local level, at a sort of a local scale. In the end, somebody has got to deal with the most difficult, least attractive, most challenged areas. And that is the local authority that will do that. And they're the basis. If that basis was sound, you could consider other schemes to, improve or do additional things. So, without local authority at the basic level, it won't work.
Perhaps could I ask? Oh, sorry, Sarah.
Well, and I think you also then start to get into what you were talking earlier about, a loss of expertise and a loss of local knowledge. So management companies that are operating as a service across lots of different areas may be able to do a good job where those tasks that they're doing are relatively standardised, but do they have the kind of local knowledge of, the 25-year history of that particular gully, or do they understand the nature of the communities that are using those spaces or those assets? I think that's another kind of human element that sometimes gets lost in some of these financial arrangements.
I'm going to ask you a question in just a few minutes about involving the community at large. But can I ask Mark, from your perspective as a highway professional, what is the most sensible area over which to maintain a highway or to run a contract? Can you divide things up sensibly? Does it need to be a big area?
I suppose I'll come to it with an anecdote then. That's probably the easiest way for me. So prior to becoming a consultant, I was a local government officer.
Could you turn the mic?
Is that a bit better? Yeah, so local government officer for 15 years. 14 of those I was a de facto bridge manager for a London borough. And the problem we had is the bridge stock. We had a bridge team which was sacked long before I joined the authority. And things gradually slid and things started to fail, and then weight limits came in and width restrictions came in, just trying to keep the stock going. And so as the person ultimately responsible, getting concerned about safety, I was telling senior staff and politicians that I can keep this infrastructure going for a long time, and if our bridges go, then you have the best surface streets in the world. You can't get across the rivers or the railways or the rest of it. And it got to the point for me where I said, okay, I'm going to run along with this maintenance regime, and at some point I will close these structures to public use. Once those, and they were fairly credible threats actually, because of the structural issues. And all of a sudden the funding was found, but it was capital funding. So the problem we had was that we can find a big lump of money to go and spend today on something, and as bridge manager it was brilliant. We got £1 billion straight away. We then get chased to go and invest that money, but that's fine. But on the revenue side, those budgets carried on getting squeezed. And so we were upgrading all of these failing structures, all the stuff that was kind of okay, getting inspected, and it was ticking along. But very, very gradually, we weren't doing the routine stuff. So clearing bearing shelves and joint seals, all sorts of wonderful stuff that nobody notices when they go over the bridge. But if they fail, you lose your structure. So I think the relationship between capital and revenue is a big problem.
And could you expand on that a little? Because this is a bit of a subtle one, so that you can capitalise some maintenance, and other maintenance has to come out of the revenue budget. Could you tell us what the dividing line is, in a way that I can understand?
Well, as I understand it, and finance people may disagree, a capital investment is you're going to build a thing, it's a new thing, whereas revenue is money to maintain that thing. Where high-base maintenance is a bit more tricky, you can have an argument over what you're replacing. So if you're completely replacing the surface of a carriageway, taking the surface off and putting a whole new one down, you can argue that's capital investment. You're putting a new, you are digging up an entire asset, 40 mil thick, and putting a new asset down. If you're reconstructing something, that's capital. If you're going in to do the odd pothole, you're sweeping it, winter maintenance, that's revenue. I don't think there's an actual line, a very hard line. It often depends on the engineers arguing with the accountants, at least in my experience.
Have you got all that? You've introduced the great mysteries of local government finance. Oh, a question.
Hello.
Sorry. Right.
Hello, I'm a local authority tree officer. The last couple of days we've heard a lot about the benefits of green infrastructure, but time after time the benefits described seem to be diffuse throughout society. So they go to the National Health Service or the Water Board, for example. But the maintenance, the cost of managing those assets is borne by the local authority, and it strikes me that that's the big problem. When people talk about rolling out green infrastructure and planting lots more trees without providing the budget for their maintenance, there needs to be some way of closing that loop to make sure that the benefits or the organisations that benefit financially provide some of the finance to manage the assets.
Yeah, so I think there's, so that's where some of these arguments about natural capital and natural capital accounting come in, and net social benefits and so forth. But I think there could be a danger in trying to close that loop too tightly. Like, for instance, I can't imagine any local NHS trust, although they are becoming more creative in, social prescribing and so forth. If a local authority is taking money from an NHS trust who's already under their own kind of financial pressures to be able to maintain trees or other things, I think we can, and certainly I have colleagues who try and come up with very clever accounting kind of mechanisms and valuation methods and so forth, and it all ends up being, it feels like you're closing the circle, but it could also just be a snake chasing its own tail. It's not, at some point we have to say, what does local government need to do, what are the expectations, and how do we fund that properly, and just take that for granted rather than necessarily trying to, take money for health benefits from someone and water benefits from water companies and so forth. That's not necessarily to say that we shouldn't look at, in water in particular, we need to make better efforts around refunds for surface water charging, those kinds of things where there is actually already a very clear material benefit that, could be paid for from, in this country, private sector companies. But some of the arguments about within the public sector, trying to transfer those kind of funds under already really struggling kind of public sector, I think is a dangerous kind of line to pursue too far.
Sue? I persevere.
I just wanted to say something about will we be taking money from the NHS to plant trees? Actually, these two things totally go together, and there have been quite a few projects already, and notably in Liverpool and with the Mersey Forest project, where actually some of the green infrastructure has been funded by the local NHS trust. The reason being that when they were then, what they found was the incidence of asthma in children in particular reduced hugely when they actually planted more trees down the streets. So they then started to look at how, by changing the urban environment, they could actually encourage people to be more healthy. And so they've done quite a lot of analysis in terms of health benefits that can accrue by encouraging people to walk and cycle and to actually get out, walk to work, cycle to work, children to go out and play in the streets. And they've very carefully linked those two things. So actually they found that they've saved money in some areas by investing in green infrastructure. So these things are never straightforward. There's many interventions. Now, how much that's rolled out elsewhere, I'm not sure. But there's good research around those things. Now, clearly we're then talking about the ongoing maintenance of those once we've got them. But I think that's where we have to wrap it up in what we're doing with our capital to actually then ensure that we're securing those long-term things through the maintenance programs when we're actually doing it.
I'm going to invite one last question before asking the panel to give a closing comment. Do we have...
Yes. I missed the main body of your talk, so I hope I'm not...
if you point the microphone directly at your face,
Right.
that's it.
I recently attended a consultation. I'm fortunate enough to live in an area with several local parks, and their management is changing to a different service provider to maintain the parks, at which point we have been asked which option we prefer, i.e. each park should have a single park keeper, or should the parks share a park keeper, because the company has been having difficulty in keeping park keepers because of the long hours, etc. But we were also asked, and I think your suggestion of asking for NHS contribution is an excellent one. I'll put that forward. We've been asked how the community would like the parks to generate income to help maintain them, obviously to take some of the weight off the local authority. Could the panel suggest some ways, some practical ways, apart from asking for NHS contribution, which, as I said, I think is an excellent idea, that the community can help raise funding within these parks for their maintenance?
I have to say that asking communities to contribute is increasingly happening. I mean, with NHS funding, that was to do new interventions, not to just maintain assets that were already in place. So I wouldn't be surprised with that. I think there are some really good models around how park management has happened in the past. If you take some of the new towns in particular, they are set up with structures through, like Milton Keynes, the Parks Trust, where they do all of that. And that is managed locally, and they sit as a body that has its own funding, that therefore manages its own land out of those budgets. And if you're a developer and you build new housing, and it doesn't matter whether it's social or private, they take on those responsibilities, and they either build the landscapes and then give them a smaller amount of money, or they give them a greater amount of money and the Parks Trust has them built and maintains them. So there's plenty of models for those sorts of things happening where it then happens across a whole place. But we are definitely seeing localised areas where communities are being asked to contribute. I think the other side of that is to then look at your management regimes that you've got in those spaces and say, well, can we manage them differently? So can we allow areas not to be mown 28 times a year and, down to goodness knows what? Can we have, more biodiverse areas that only need managing twice a year? Can we understand that that's now visually and socially acceptable to do so? So I think we have to look at it from both ends. How much do we want to fund? Are we prepared to contribute? But can we actually look at it differently and find other ways to do it better and cheaper?
Sarah.
I would also say that Friends of Parks groups and community groups in general can often provide a really good connector between different bits of local authorities. And so I would encourage you to talk to your local flood officer, because there may actually be funds available for surface water management, or even funding from the Environment Agency if that particular park is at you might know, or they would know, is there a flood risk in that area. So sometimes there are, particularly around water and flood management, there might be funds that are available that people your parks officers won't know about because they're not thinking about surface water and they don't talk to the flood person, and sometimes the Friends of Parks groups are the ones that close that triangle.
Peter, I think you wanted to comment.
How's that? Oh, yeah, that's working. Parks is another area where local government's really seen heavy cuts. Local government itself has responded through greater sort of commercial, the big picture seems to be that they've done rather well overall on increasing commercial income, but I suspect again that varies enormously between local authorities and probably between parks as well. I was encouraged to hear that the NHS is contributing money under certain circumstances. I think, as I was understanding it, you were saying almost that knowledge about the gains of that was sitting inside the NHS itself, that wasn't, as it were, the local authority just coming along and saying, if you do this, then or if we do this, you'll get some gains. They were obviously persuaded that there were gains. The NHS were persuaded, and that's the critical thing, I think, because otherwise it's obviously very easy to, dismiss those. Sounds like you're doing participatory budgeting then on what to do with these sort of consultations. Presumably all options are inferior to what you have at the minute, I imagine. And it's the rapid, so it's this loss of experience. People who used to know how the bridges worked in this unnamed London borough and are now out in the private sector. I'm boring. I don't see any alternative to proper funding underneath this. With proper funding, then you can do a great amount of innovation, great amount of consultation and involvement of the community, bringing in the NHS. But if the floor isn't solid on which that's built, it's not a viable system.
We're out of time, but would the panel like to make any final comments, final thoughts?
I'll go first. So certainly for our urban places, we've got lots of asset out there, and I think it's just a matter of how we use it. So if we are going to improve walking and cycling, we still need to go and build stuff. We have all these corridors which are already laid on for us that we can just drop these things into. We can reduce traffic in side streets, and so the maintenance burden can be reduced as well. So the roads are linear quarries, as contractors would say. That there is stuff out there we can reuse, whether it's materials or whether it's a space.
Thank you. Who's next? Sue. And I'll finish with Sarah. Is that?
So my one would be, is just get out there and talk to people, engage with people at all levels, in all ways, about what you can do and how you can do it. Have those conversations and try and encourage people to engage and then to take ownership of what's there. So if people have pride in their local communities and their places, then they're much more likely to ensure that they're looked after properly. You just have to have as many conversations as possible, see where the funding is, see where those little opportunities are, even if it's at small scale. It's where we are.
Peter, a last thought.
I was very struck by what you said in your opening remarks, your presentation about the low status of a lot of this work, and I think that is right. You only have to compare it with HS2 and so forth to see those things that have money and those that don't. And I think it's very important that, just to reiterate, people link up, that you have an interest in strong and sensible local government, and I think it's important that local government understands that it has allies, not uncritical allies, but it has allies and others outside who think what it does is important.
And Sarah?
So I guess sort of going back even before this session started, part of the origin of it was a radio program that Chris Bowlby from the BBC did on maintenance. I don't know if any of you heard that, but he is a BBC journalist who started getting interested in maintenance because he was doing political reporting and realising the terrible state of the houses of Westminster. And there's now a massive investment going on to try to restore and maintain the very heart of our democracy. And there's all sorts of metaphors you can make around the lack of spending on, the most important building in this country. So I think there is, that's a really iconic example of something that's really important that just wasn't taken care of and ended up, with the massive kind of work that needs to go on now. So I think there is kind of a bit of a moment. This climate emergency, all of these things really do, I think, provide us with a moment to step back and say, what is it that's valuable? And is it new, shiny, fast, speedy, expensive stuff, or actually do we need to go back to basics and take care of, ourselves, our institutions, and our, buildings in which things like democracy happen?
Thank you very much for the contributions. I think this has been in many ways rather a sad session, and it's so important. Look at that. I mean, that looks pretty good, doesn't it? It's well maintained, it's attractive, and the research suggests that people in a looked after environment, they behave in what they call a pro-social way. They look after one another, they're courteous, they are responsible citizens, they contribute to the maintenance of society. If the environment ends up being neglected, imagine some dumped bicycles, litter, potholes, damage, vandalism, graffiti. People are going to behave in a totally different way. They're going to look out for themselves. This is what the research suggests. And this is the desperate situation that we've got. The suggestions are that we've got to do more as individuals. But if the environment becomes decayed and neglected, our natural tendency is going to be to do less as individuals and to focus more on protecting our own interests. So, what did you say? No alternative to proper funding. That's got to be the message. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the speakers. I think this has been a fascinating and a dismal session, but it's got to be resolved. And I hope when you leave here, write to your MP or something, or do something positive about this situation. Tolstoy said, the most important time is now, because it is now that it is the time when the only time when we have any power. Let's see what we can do. Thank you very much. Enjoy the last few minutes of Future Build.